Okay, thank you. So I'm very glad to be back here, and thanks for being there again. So this is what we covered yesterday. This is what we are going to cover today. So yesterday we talked a lot about the long-run evolution of income distribution and wealth distribution, mostly in the West. And today we are going to talk about other parts of the world and the level of inequality that we can measure, and also about the political consequences of rising inequality and more about the politics of redistribution. So we are going to start with inequality in emerging countries and the post-colonial world, what I describe here as extreme inequality regime in the Middle East, in Brazil, in South Africa, and then we'll move to the last part on the political conflict dimension. Okay, so let me start with the first point on inequality in developing countries and the post-colonial world. So let me again repeat what I said yesterday at the beginning. One of the main limitations of my book, there are many limitations, but certainly one of the most obvious limitations is that it does not talk enough about emerging countries, the developing world, and it's very much centered on the experience of Western Europe, the US, Japan to some extent, Canada, but there's very little outside the developed countries, partly, because of a problem of data access, and I'm going to return to this, but I think it's deeper than this. It's also that, my own view has been very much influenced by my study of France, and of the US with Emmanuel Saez, Tony Atkinson in the UK, and so our way of looking at the problems is is very much influenced by this, and you could see yesterday in the graph I was showing you that World War I, World War II were everywhere, and of course that's important in the history of Europe, but if we take a broader view on inequality, it is much less important when you look at inequality in Brazil, in India, and so the study of inequality regime, broadly speaking, is not just a study about how World War I and World War II destroyed wealth and whether we have a return to the pre-World War I pattern or not, which is an interesting problematic and interesting issue, but we cannot only talk about this. And certainly one of the limitations of my book is that it's very much centered around this issue of where the post-World War II decades exceptional, why are we returning to the situation 1 century ago? And I think it's important to go beyond this sort of Western-centered and also 20th century-centered in a way, and the perspective very much centered on the shock of the 20th century. So I am now trying with many colleagues and PhD students and friends and co-authors to develop more work on inequality measurement in a number of emerging countries. And actually, it's probably, to me, this was the most interesting impact of the success of the book was, as I said yesterday, to make more data accessible in a number of countries. In particular, new data was made accessible in countries like South Africa, Brazil, to some extent, some Middle East country, India, China, and generally speaking, what we, maybe from a quantitative viewpoint, the first important finding is that official inequality measures tend to vastly underestimate inequality. So official inequality measures are usually based on household survey, which of course are very useful tools, but the problem with household survey is that it's entirely based on self-reported data on income and wealth. And particularly at the top of the distribution, you just don't get very good information from self-reporting. So given that the share of total income going to the top 10% can be 50% or 40% or 60%, and the share of wealth can be 70%, 80%, 90%. If you don't get it right for such a big share of the distribution, you're going to have a hard time reconciling the kind of growth statistics you get in the national accounts and GDP figures with what you get when you try to measure inequality. So this will create a suspicion. So in the sense that people, when they are told about GDP growth rate and they look at their own income and what we learn from household survey, it's not always in line with one another. So I think it's very important to try to combine these different sources. So the issue is not to throw away household survey, of course not, we need household survey, but to combine them with other data sources, national accounts, and also fiscal data. And I think one of the important lessons of our work is that even in countries where the tax system is not working very well, and there's no country where the tax system is working perfectly well. You always have tax evasion, you always have problem with the tax administration, you always have the notion of taxable income always allows you to sort of get away with some income components. But even in this case, and even in emerging countries where you would expect the income tax administration not to work so well, the big lesson of our work is that at least it gives us more plausible estimates of the top income groups than what we have in household survey. So probably this is still a lower bound for the true inequality of income, if you want, or wealth, but this lower bound is a lot higher than what you get in household survey and probably a lot more plausible. You have to be aware of the fact that the household survey we use to measure inequality in many developing countries, there's just nobody who is really rich. You take a household survey in Argentina, there's nobody that has more than 3 or 4 times the average income of Argentina. And we know there are people who have more than 3 or 4 times the average income. So if you're missing a big part, that's a problem. So let me first show you some examples of what we get in a number of emerging or developing countries. So first, looking at South Africa. This doesn't want to work. Yeah. So here I'm going to show you results on South Africa coming from a study by Tony Atkinson and Facundo Alvaredo, who have been working on this historical data for South Africa. So this is the top 1% income share in South Africa in red compared with the US and France. So you can see it's very high level of inequality. It's even more striking if you look at the top 10% income share. So there is a lot of variation, which sometimes reflects more problem with the tax administration itself than with the income data. So I'm not saying that all the volatility that you have here is realistic, but I'm just asking you to look at the general level of inequality. So you can see that the top 1% income share in South Africa is higher than in the US, but not that much higher, at least for the recent period. The top 10% income share seems to be a lot higher, and even though the data is not perfect, there is some volatility at the end of the 80s, which maybe reflect more the disorganization of the tax administration than a real decline in inequality, and this should be corrected in one way or another. But the general level of inequality is extremely high at the level of the top 10% income share. Now, of course, in South Africa, it's a country where you have about 10% of the population who is white and 90% who is non-white and mostly black, and huge part, like 80% of the top 10% of the income distribution is actually made of white people. So this corresponds to the situation in South Africa where the top 1% share maybe is not so different from what we have in the US, but what's really distinctive in South Africa is that you have a bigger group than just 1%. You have typically about 10% of the population that is very far away from the rest of society, and I will return to this a bit later when we look, generally speaking, across the world at countries with extreme level of inequality, and of course South Africa, together with Brazil and the Middle East, as we will see, is a prime example of this. Let me illustrate measurement issues, and then I will talk more about the mechanism, but first starting just with measurement. In the case of Brazil, you can see that moving from the official survey data to a combination of survey and fiscal data changes quite a lot the orders of magnitude, because when we use the official survey data, Brazil seems to be less unequal than the US. But when you move and you use the fiscal data, then Brazil is a lot more unequal than the US, which is probably more reasonable, and probably the fiscal data is still a lower bound for inequality. So this clearly illustrates that even in a country like Brazil, where the income tax data is certainly not perfect, at least this gets us to something that is more plausible. This is true for the top 1%. This is, again, also true for the top 10%, where you can see that for Brazil, once you correct for fiscal data, you get more than 55% of total income for the top 10%. So this is getting really, really large. And so this is not quite South Africa, where we were getting to over 60%, 65%, but this is still very large. Again, I'm not trying to pretend that these are the final numbers, the best estimate we can get. The data is imperfect, but at least in terms of orders of magnitude, we get to numbers that are first, more plausible than the survey-based measure, and typically higher than what we have in the most unequal developed country, which itself is more unequal than the European countries or Japan, as we've seen yesterday. If you look at the evolution, well, the problem is that so far we were not able to access to the complete archives of fiscal data for Brazil. In fact, even this data for the recent period, we could not. I did not have it for at the time of my book, so this is why you will not find this kind of comparison in my book. And it's only after the publication of my book, I asking again and again to the Brazilian tax administration and government that finally we could get access to this, but we only have this short period of time, 2006, 2012. I think we now have for 2013, 14, but we don't have before 2006. So we don't really know about the long-run evolution, because if you look at the official series, we're supposed to have a decline in inequality according to the survey data, but as you can see for the recent period where we have the tax data, it looks very different. So we don't have the complete series before, so it means that it's not only the level of inequality that looks different when you move to tax data, it's also the trend can be different. So in the end, was inequality reduced in Brazil under Lula and during the past 15 years? This is very much an open question. It could be that I'm not saying it was not reduced at all. There are some policies regarding the minimum wage and various social programs which could well explain why it should have declined. I'm just saying that at this stage, all what we have is the survey data, which we know for the recent period is not giving us the right trend. So okay, we are not sure. And I think it's important because if we want to have a quiet, democratic conversation about inequality and policy, well, it's always difficult to have a quiet discussion about taxation and redistribution, but at least if we want to have a more informed conversation, we need to get the facts right, or at least to know more about the evolution. Otherwise, it's very difficult to have an informed discussion. Now, over and beyond measurement problems, I want to stress that we need to go beyond a Western-centered and 20th century-centered view of inequality regime, because if we want to understand what I call here extreme inequality regime, so countries or time periods where you have the extreme level of inequalities or the highest level of income inequalities that we see, you can see that it involves mechanisms that are not just, demand and supply of skills, wealth accumulation, transmission through inheritance, like the mechanism we talked about yesterday. Typically, it involves a lot of brutal discrimination. So, in particular, extreme inequality is usually associated with a very strong legacy in terms of racial discrimination or rigid inequality of status, and which has not much to do with the kind of meritocratic fairy tales that we sometimes tell when we describe the generation of inequality. So South Africa is a clear example. Until 1994, which was basically yesterday, or 20 years ago, you have the apartheid, which means very concretely that you have 90% of the population, the black population, was no right to property, no right to mobility. So in the sense that they need to live in certain areas, very small areas of the South African territory, and they cannot own any property outside this territory. So of course you start from a situation where concentration of property is very extreme, because by definition 90% of the population, they just don't have the right to move. So it's very close. It's not serfdom, it's not slavery, but it's a very strong restriction on basic mobility rights and ownership rights. This system fell in 1994, but there was no land redistribution of any form. There was no attempt, to start over again with a different initial distribution of wealth. I'm not saying this is easy to do. Look, land reform is always complicated, wealth redistribution is always complicated. I'm just saying that some countries did it in the past and South Africa did not do it. So many countries had land reform in the past. Okay, the French Revolution certainly introduced some form of land reform, but if we look in the 20th century, you can also see lots of countries in Asia, in particular in 1945, 1950, in Japan, in Korea, Taiwan, who have very important land reform, not to mention communist China, but even talking of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, you have very strong land reform, which contributed in these countries to have a more egalitarian initial distribution of assets, which together with a policy of investment in education and inclusive social investment contributed, according to all observers, to a more successful development strategy. You have many comparisons that were made. For instance, you compare Korea, Taiwan on the one hand, the Philippines on the other hand. In 1950s, they look a lot similar in GDP per capita. You have some countries that have a much more egalitarian redistribution strategy and investment strategy in the end that are much more successful than a country like the Philippines, where more extreme concentration of property and resources persisted until today. So I'm just saying South Africa, after the fall of the apartheid, made the choice so far of no wealth taxation, no wealth redistribution, no land reform. And so it's not so surprising that the level of inequality is still very high. Brazil is another example of a country where, again, the legacy of history is extremely strong. So as you probably know, Brazil is the last country which abolished slavery in 1887. And at that time, you have 30% of the population that was slaves. So 30% is very big, and with huge regional disparities, in particular between the northeast and other parts of the country. So you have a very strong legacy of extreme inequalities that does not disappear easily unless you have very sort of aggressive policy to build a more egalitarian system, which was not pursued in Brazil, at least until recently. And I'm not going to elaborate about the specific political history recently of Brazil, but of course that's complicated. If you take the case of the US, certainly this is another example where you have a very strong legacy of racial discrimination. So until 1865, you had slavery in the south part of the US. 40% of the population was made of slaves until 1865. So this is very large. If we compare different forms of slave societies in history, you do find some example with more than half, but it's very rare. So 40% is a lot. I mean, the example with more than half of the population in slavery are typically you have the Haiti, Saint-Domingue, until the French Revolution, where you have up to 80-90% of the population with slaves, but this is also the reason why in the end they revolt at the beginning of the French Revolution, and it's very difficult to maintain slavery with 90% of the population as slave, even if you have a good technology to control the slave. So anyway, 40% is already a lot by historical standards, and this is the in terms of number of slaves, this is one of the main historical examples of a very developed slavery system. Now, this was abolished in 1865, but as you know, legal discrimination was maintained until the 1960s, so you don't have the right to go to the same bus, the same school, you don't have voting rights, so this was just 50 years ago. And clearly, this is something that has a strong impact until today. And of course, and I will talk more about this later today, the racial inequality in the US does not only have an impact on the inequality between the black minority and the white majority. It probably also contributed to the different political trajectories than what we have in Europe, and in particular, many people believe, and I think it is certainly part of the explanation, that this contributed to prevent the development of a European-style welfare state, in the sense that there was less solidarity, and many white taxpayers in particular were not ready to pay for what they perceive to be the black minorities that will benefit from this welfare state payment, and this is the kind of attitude that we've seen, of course, with the Obamacare reform and in the recent debate last year in the US. So this is something that has consequences well beyond just the inequality between the black and the white. And of course, this is a risk that some people feel we also have today in Europe with the development of a very strong anti-Muslim racism. And speaking from France, and given the election we have this week, of course, this is a real issue, and this creates a question as to when you don't have this kind of basic solidarity within a country, can make it more difficult to develop vertical redistribution, and I will come back to this later today. The point I want to make now is that even though extreme inequality is usually associated with an historical legacy of very strong racial discrimination and rigid inequality of status, there are exceptions, and it's interesting to see, one of the exceptions I want to stress now is the Middle East. So if you take the Middle East as a whole, and these are estimates before the war in Syria. This has not to do with the war. I mean, the war and the political instability of the region may have something to do with the inequality of resources, although this is certainly not the only factors. But the estimates I'm going to show you are before the war. If we try to estimate the inequality of income in the Middle East region as a whole, even though the data we have is certainly not perfect, the conclusion that comes immediately is that this is probably the most unequal region in the world, not due to racial discrimination or past legacy with slavery, but to completely different factors, which is a very extreme geographical concentration of oil resources, pretty arbitrary frontiers, so that the oil resources are located in certain countries, so typically Kuwait rather than Iraq, of very specific frontiers that were drawn, as we know, in particular by Britain and France in 1916 at the end of World War I, which are still there, at least until recently, and to some extent they are being redrawn right now in a very chaotic manner, of course. But this is this system of frontiers which contributed to this very extreme inequality of resources. So if we try to measure income inequality at the level of the region as a whole, then what we find is that the top 10% income share is at least 60% of total income, and probably higher. This is assuming a very low level of within country inequality. This simply comes from the huge inequality between countries, and that will be much more than in Europe, about 35% for the top 10% share, more than in the US, and more than in South Africa or Brazil. And this is mostly due to huge inequality between countries. So typically, I make the comparison in my book between Egypt and United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Basically, if you have Egypt is a country with almost 100 million inhabitants now, between 90 and 100. And if you look at the total budget for education for the entire country, this is a couple of $1 billion. This is 100 times less than the oil revenues, which go a few hundred kilometers away to small territories with very limited population. We have 1 million total local population in United Arab Emirates and Qatar, and even within these groups, oil resources are very concentrated. So you have a level of inequality which is possible to call extreme. So just to show the numbers we get. So this is a study that we did with Facundo Alvaredo and Lydia Aswad, both from Syria and from France. And we could access, so we are starting to have access to the income tax files in some Arab countries, in particular in Lebanon. But as I said, mostly what we do in this work is just to use the extreme level of inequality between countries. So here I look at the Middle East. So what is the Middle East in this estimate? So this is the regions going from Egypt to Iraq, including Syria, including Saudi Arabia. So this is a region of 280 million inhabitants. So this is comparable in size to the US and to Western Europe. So it makes sense in a way to look at inequality at this level, because I think also perceptions of inequality, sometime after the Arab Spring movement, some people said, based on some World Bank report, saying, okay, why are they so unhappy? After all, inequality in a country in Egypt doesn't seem to be so large according to our household survey estimate. Well, first, this household survey estimate probably underestimate inequality in Egypt. And probably also, the young generation in Egypt or whatever, they compare themselves not only to Egypt, but to the region, if not to the world, but certainly to the region. Everybody knows the inequality between the countries. So looking at inequality just at the level of the nation state of France or Egypt individually may not be the right perspective. We may want to look at inequality from a regional perspective or even from a global perspective. So this is something we try to do in our new inequality database. You can change the perspective and integrate countries and look at inequality from a different perspective than just the existing frontiers. So if you do that, so you get that the Middle East is clearly a lot more unequal than Western Europe or the US, and also more unequal than South Africa and Brazil. And again, the Middle East estimate is probably the more underestimated here. We really don't want to exaggerate the case. Probably when we have access to better data, we will get closer to 65-70%. There are also conceptual issues because, of course, when you think of the royal family in Saudi Arabia, the wealth of the family, the wealth of the state, how do you attribute the property? So here we don't even try to get into that. We have very lower bound estimate of inequality within country. Okay, so the true estimate maybe will be 70% or higher. I don't know. So oil, the concentration of oil resources is very important. The other mechanism, of course, is finance. Okay, so the role of sovereign wealth funds and global financial markets is very important because this is what allows to transform oil rent into sort of perpetual financial rent. Okay, so that extreme inequality level of this sort can persist long after the end of oil. Okay, because you transform, and I showed you yesterday the kind of return, financial return you can have to large wealth portfolio. So the data we have on sovereign funds is not as good as the data we have for US universities, so I'm not going to be able to show you the return to sovereign funds, but this gives you a sense of how the self-perpetuating these effects can be. If you start by accumulating large sovereign wealth fund and then you have very high returns. So it's really a combination of oil, frontiers, and modern finance that can lead you to this very extreme level of inequality within a region. So I think it's important because you see, there's racial discrimination, slavery, very important in South Africa, in Brazil, to some extent in the US. Now, in the Middle East, there's a near complete absence of historical legacy of slavery or forced labor, at least since the rise of Islam. I mean, you had slaves in the antiquity, but at least for the past 1,500 years, there's been no forced labor or slavery in the Middle East. So this is not the origin of inequality in the Middle East. You have a completely different origin, which is much more modern in nature, in a way. This is oil resources, modern colonial frontiers, modern financial markets, which in the end get you to a level of inequality that is even more extreme than what you get in Brazil, in South Africa after apartheid and after slavery. And I think this is striking because this shows that you can have very different mechanisms which both have not much to do with the mechanism we talked about yesterday, but which in both cases can lead to what I call extreme level of inequality. So this is also saying that modern inequality sometimes has little to do with the kind of meritocratic fairy tales that we tell, where we say, well, today inequality is different. It's all about innovation and socially useful innovation for everybody. Well, if you look at this, the map of inequality in the Middle East, there's not much of this. It is much more brutal in nature. It involves a mixture of old mechanism, new mechanism, and the new components, like those I just described for the Middle East, can be, as violent as the old one in many ways. So, what is the solution? Look, there's no simple solution. Ideally, you will need certainly regional political integration. So, if the European Union was working better, maybe, you know, the Middle East would like to create a Middle East union, which actually exists in a way through the Arab League, but with, you know, very little power. And of course, the situation right now is not really a situation where, you know, the Arab League is going to become more powerful. But, you know, I think even though this is not going to happen anytime soon, this is not a reason not to think about it and not to talk about it, because at some point it will come back. You know, at some point, you know, regional integration and more democratic redistribution of resources is better than redistribution via, you know, invading the territory of your neighbor and what we've seen with Iraq and Kuwait, etc. So, you know, I think if we refuse to talk about peaceful redistribution between countries which are in the same regions, you know, you can end up with much less peaceful mechanisms. So, you know, these are very difficult issues. Regional European funds, you know, may not be perfect, but at least they redistribute a little bit between countries, well, except that some voters don't like it, you know, in particular in this country. So the transfer right now between European countries through regional structural fund are not huge, but, you know, they are typically countries, the richest country like Germany or Britain until now, France, were paying in net of the order of 0.5 to 1%, actually closer to 0.5% of GDP, more than what they received. So the net contribution was of the order of 0.5% of GDP, which is not that much, but which is still something, okay? It's as compared to the mechanism where the Egyptian government is asking money to the king of Saudi Arabia and the Saudi Arabian government, and then with keeping entirely the control of what they decide to give or not, and where they give, in fact, very little. You know, it's still a more satisfactory mechanism. It's also comparable to if you think of foreign aid to developing countries, you know, I think the UK is actually doing pretty well as compared to countries like France, and I think it's of the order of 0.7% of GDP right now in the UK. So it's not uncomparable, except that the Brexit voters and the British voters voted against that, and I don't know about development aid. Maybe also a difference with development aid is that for development aid, the countries, in particular Britain, they keep control of what they want to do each year, whereas with the regional political integration, like European integration, it's in a way more ambitious because you have the creation of a decision-making process at the regional level through the European Union. So when you give 0.5% of GDP, you don't control as much what you do. Anyway, these are, you know, redistribution is very complicated to organize within a given country. You know, of course, when it's at the international level, it's more complicated, but I think this will become more and more important in the future in many different regions, and so we ought to talk more about this. Generally speaking, you know, the general message I get from this looking at these inequality regimes across the planet is that there's, you know, we have the illusion sometime in the West that modern inequality is completely different from ancient inequality. Okay, so modern inequality is supposed to be based on equality of rights, meritocracy, you know, everybody has equal opportunity, whereas ancient inequality is supposed to be based upon slavery, rigid inequality of status, etc. But what I want to argue in this presentation, and we've already talked about this yesterday and again today, is that meritocracy, it's not that it does not exist at all, but to a large extent, this is a myth invented by the winners of the system. You know, remember yesterday when we look at the relation between parental income and access to university in the US, you know, you can see that this has very little to do with equal opportunity. And I think it's important to confront, you know, the claims that are made about modern inequality and the real, as opposed to formal rights, which actual individuals, in particular with more disadvantaged backgrounds, have. You also have huge discrimination, you know, not only, of course, in the US or in South Africa, but certainly in Europe, certainly in France, you know, you have massive evidence of huge discrimination for people who have Muslim-sounding names, and you sent. There are lots of studies. You sent 1,000 CV, and you just change the name, and you are called Muhammad instead of Michel, and you just don't get any proposal for job interview. And there are even recent studies showing that this is even worse when you improve the CV. So if you take, you're looking for a job as an accountant, you went to the best accounting school, you had the best job experience during the summer, and even then, your probability to get an interview remains 5%, whereas people who are called Michel, their job interview probability is multiplied by 3 when you move to the bad CV to the best CV. So all these studies are really extremely depressing. And so I think, we sometimes, for instance, when we look at debates on reservations and quotas in countries like India, we tend to look at this as if this was not at all an issue for us. I mean us in the West, and we tend to consider, okay, this is India, for instance, it's another world, you have caste, you have lower caste, upper caste, we are not at all in a society like this, we don't care about this. I think, in fact, there is a lot to learn by confronting this different experience with inequality. And for instance, in India, if you look at the GNU University in Delhi, you have an admission system where you take into account both the grade you get in the entrance exam and points that have to do with your income, your parental income group, and you combine the two in order to decide upon admission, which is, taking into account parental income is probably better than taking into account the caste or ethnic origin, but it's a complicated discussion. We are not going to solve this today, but I'm just saying that there are some interesting mechanisms that have been used in this case in GNU, which are relevant in France and certainly in Britain as well for admissions to high school or universities. And I think these are issues that we should open, and rather than believing that modern inequality is not about this and we don't need to care about this. Let me now turn more directly to the issue of political conflict. So we've been talking a lot already about politics, of course, but here I would like to address more directly the issue of the consequences of rising inequality for political attitude. So, in a way, we are facing a big paradox today, especially after the election of Trump, after Brexit, after what we have this week in France with Marine Le Pen and the extreme right at the second round of the election, is that with rising inequality, we could have expected a rising demand for redistribution. If you have a rising gap between top incomes and bottom incomes, maybe you would expect the political system to react by having political parties offer more vertical redistribution between the rich and the poor, and therefore, in a way, more class-based political conflict. And to some extent, what we see is different. What we seem to see is more the rise of more, xenophobic populism and identity-based politics with Brexit, Trump, Le Pen, but also Modi to some extent in India, rather than more class-based, income-based or wealth-based politics. So one explanation, I guess one of the standard explanations that people have in mind is that with globalization and competition between countries, vertical redistribution is very difficult to organize because you have tax competition, everybody's trying to attract investment, high-income voters. Therefore, it's very difficult to develop new forms of class-based politics. Therefore, we have to revert to something else. So, basically, if you are not able, the strategy of Le Pen, typically in France, is something like this. We are not able to regulate capitalism and to tax Microsoft or tax haven. So, let's tax all the young people with Muslim origins in France, and let's be harsh with them. At least this is easier to do than to make people at Microsoft or tax havens pay more, except that these people, with Muslim origins, they already face an unemployment rate of 40% or 50%. So it's not by, hurting them more that you're going to improve the situation of the others. So I think it's a complete illusion, but to some extent, and of course, this is a very, this is a strategy that is based on a lot of sort of cowardice and cowardness and everything you can think of that. But I think that to some extent, this is a little bit what has been happening. So disillusion with respect to the possibility of vertical redistribution has contributed to lead to more xenophobic populism, identity-based politics. Now, I think this is partly true. I mean, I'm not saying it's good, but that's certainly part of the explanation is the feeling that globalization and competition makes it more difficult to have vertical redistribution. But I think this is not the end of the story, and it will be, very sort of pessimistic, and I think also very limited intellectually to just stop there. Because, well, first, there are several reasons for this. First reason is that there is really nothing in globalization that makes redistribution and new forms of egalitarianism technically impossible. So it's not a technical problem. It's primarily political and ideological. So, okay, it's more difficult to have income or wealth taxation in a globalized world than in a single country, but the fact that it's more difficult doesn't mean that it's impossible. So in particular, there are proposals that were made by Gabriel Zucman or others to develop a global wealth register in order to exchange, to have automatic exchange of information between the tax administration in the US, in Europe, in Japan, in order to better control wealth flow and to have a coordinated tax on wealth. Technically, there's nothing very difficult in this. It's primarily a political, ideological reason. So just saying, okay, globalization make it impossible, and therefore this is the end of the story, I think it's a bit lazy. And in particular, what makes me more optimistic, or at least what makes me convinced that there are alternatives, there are different ways things can change in the future, is that if you look actually at the history of progressive taxation in the 20th century, you do see a lot of surprise. You do see sharp reversal, you do see unexpected political bifurcation, unstable process. So, we are not, the history of inequality and redistribution is not a deterministic story. So just if we return a little bit to the evolution of progressive taxation in the past, so this is a short summary. So these are top income tax rate in 4 countries, US, UK, Germany, France, between 1900 and 2013. So as you can see, the history of progressive taxation is a complicated history. It's lots of surprise. So, so when people tell me, progressive wealth tax will never happen in the future, I want to tell them, well, look at history. Things happen. Sometimes, at the beginning of the 20th century, many people said that the income tax will never happen. And indeed, in the US in particular, it was impossible with the Constitution to have a federal income tax, so they had to change the Constitution in 1913 in order to create the income tax. In France was actually the last country to introduce the income tax in 1914, which is very interesting because, again, you can see, sometimes the hypocrisy of the elite with respect to inequality. In France, the big argument until 1914, before the creation of the income tax, which at the end was created not to pay for schools or to pay for public services, but to pay to finance the war with Germany. This is the only thing that made the French Republican elite vote the income tax. But until 1914, there was an income tax in Germany for already 30 years, in Japan, in Sweden. In Britain, there was an income tax that was created at the middle of the 19th century, but it was proportional. It became a progressive income tax in 1908. So it was not a lot before 1914, but it was in peacetime. It was not to pay for the war. In the US, it was in 1913, but again, it was in peacetime. France was really the very last country to create the income tax. And it's interesting to see the political argument at the time that were used by the French political and Republican elites. So this was the Third Republic. The argument was, okay, in France, we have made the French Revolution, and this is enough, basically. We are a country of equals, because thanks to the French Revolution and the little redistribution of land that was made, which was in fact quite limited, but we have become a country of equals, so we don't need progressive income tax. Britain, of course, needs an income tax because Britain is an aristocratic country, so much inequality, very bad. They need progressive taxation. But in France, not necessary. Except that when I look at my inheritance archives in Paris in 1913, the level of inequality that I see is the same as in Britain and other European societies. because at that time the issue was not so much, aristocratic landed estate, which did not really matter at that time, except in Downton Abbey. But in the real life, I have shown you actually a graph yesterday. Agricultural land was less than 5% of national wealth in Britain in 1913, or in France. So what mattered was much more modern investment vehicles, the financial assets, foreign investment, real estate, business assets, and the fact of being a republic rather than a monarchy in France. I'm very happy to be in a republic, and this doesn't make much of a difference in itself in terms of concentration of property. So in the end, the hypocrisy of the elite sometimes can be, the elites always have a lot of imagination to justify inequality. So anyway, in France, until 1914, there was no income tax at all, whereas you can see in Germany or in Britain, it has started a little before. You see 1908 for Britain, for the UK, and in Germany it was already there. But the tax rates were very small everywhere. And then suddenly, so in France, when it was introduced in 1914, the top tax rate was 2%, and most people in the parliament thought it was too much. We cannot do that. And then 10 years later, you get to 50, 60, 70%. And in fact, the country that led the evolution was very much the US and to a lesser extent the UK. But in particular, the US, you can see that they go to 70, 80% in the 1920s. And between 1930 and 1980, on average in the US, the top tax rate is 82%. Okay, it's sometime 91% under Roosevelt, with the famous victory tax of 1942, which was voted after Pearl Harbor. You had a top tax rate of 91%, which was applied until the 1960s. Sometimes it was 70%, like in the 70s before the election of Reagan. The average tax rate between 1930 and 1980 was 82%, and this is only the federal tax rate in the case of the US. You also had state income tax, typically 5 to 10%, depending on the state. Okay, this was applied for half a century, and apparently this did not destroy American capitalism. Otherwise we would have noticed it. And if anything, productivity growth rate for the US economy during this period in the 50s, 60s, 70s were higher than what they've been since Reagan 1980 and the big reduction of top tax rate. So, I know, many people are not ready for a discussion like this, and I don't know how much time it will take for people to be ready, but I think it's important, as scholars, that we accept to look at this evidence with an open eye, and we just ask ourselves, okay, how did it work? What were the consequences for the distribution of income, for productivity? My reading of the evidence is that it played a big role to compress the distribution of income and wealth at the very top without much negative effect in terms of productivity of incentives of innovation. But, this is an open discussion. I don't pretend my conclusion is the only possible one, but at least we should look at historical evidence, because sometimes people forget that we have this huge record. So this is what we have for top income tax rate. This is the same if you look at top tax rate on wealth. Okay, so this is for top tax rate on inheritance. And again, you can see, so today it's more or less the same in all these countries, around 40%, although Trump said last week he wanted to get rid entirely of the inheritance tax and get it to 0%, which is I don't know. I'm not sure it will be adopted, but until now, it's we have about 40% in top inheritance tax rate in all these countries. But during much of the 20th century, it was much higher in the US, in the UK. Well, partly because in France and Germany, redistribution of wealth took place in another way, through destruction of wealth, through very large inflation. And I think that's part of the reason why France and Germany didn't go as far in terms of tax progressivity than the US and the UK. But, I tend to prefer progressive taxation as a form of redistribution than war and inflation. I think it's more civilized. And so in that case, civilized redistribution was invented, in particular by the US and by the UK. It's interesting to see. In the 1920s, when very high top tax rates were introduced in the US, you can see at that time, it's one of the motivation for this was that it looks very strange viewed from today, but at that time, the US perception was that we should not become as unequal as Europe. And indeed, at that time, remember the data I have shown you yesterday, Europe was actually more unequal than the US. And so the big fear was to become like, aristocratic Europe, or, Europe was viewed as very unequal. So in particular, you have this very famous speech of Irving Fisher, who was president of the American Economic Association, who was not at all, an extreme left-wing militant, was very centrist in many ways, but he was very concerned about rising inequality in the US, and he made this famous speech in 1919. He was the president of the American Economic Association, and he came to the annual meetings, as they have still today, and he said, well, my fellow American economists, there is one big danger with the US economy, that we become more unequal. We have 2% of the population has 50% of the wealth. In Europe, it is 1% of the population that has more than 50% of the wealth. If we become like Europe, we will not be a democratic country anymore, because, in order to have democracy in America, like Tocqueville said a century before, you need some form of equality of property, otherwise democracy will be controlled by a small elite. So I have thought hard about the problem. We are not going to put an end to private property. We are not the Soviet Union, but we are going to have very steeply progressive taxation of inherited wealth. And his proposal was, okay, I have thought hard, I am president of the American Economic Association, what we should do is the following. We are going to tax inheritance at a rate equal to 1/3 at the first generation, 2/3 at the second generation, and 3/3 at the last generation. So this is not exactly what happened, but it is close, because in the end the top tax rate went to 70–80%. Okay, so this is very spectacular. This can seem very far away, but this is part of our common history. You can also see that Germany, the only time when you have this very high top tax rate in Germany for inheritance and also for income. You see 1946 to 1948 in Germany, you have a 90% top tax rate. Well, this is when the tax policy of Germany is set by the Americans. Okay, this is the Allied Control Council that is setting the tax policy of Germany. And once the Germans take their sovereignty back in 1949, they immediately reduce their top tax rate to 50%, to what they view as more reasonable level, and they want to escape from this crazy American level of 90%. And the Americans were not doing that to punish the Germans. They were doing the same in Japan. You also have 90% top tax rate at the time in Japan. But it was not a punishment, because they were doing the same at home with their own top income. So it was not a punishment. In the American view of the time, this was part of the civilization package, if you want. You bring democratic institutions together with the fiscal institution that will prevent democracy from becoming a plutocracy with extreme concentration of wealth, property, and influence and political power. So, I know this seems like ancient history to some of you, but, in the end, this is not so far away. So, my first point about political attitudes is that they can change. So they are influenced by lots of factors, and things will change again in the future. So if we try to understand, the forces behind, this high redistribution period of the 20th century between 1930 and 1980, you have unique circumstances like wars and revolution and depression. But what's interesting is that these unique circumstances, which could or could not have happened, led to structural change. First, in political belief toward capitalism and markets. So it's clear that the Great Depression, World War I, World War II completely changed the perceptions of what laissez-faire can deliver and what self-regulated markets can deliver. But also, the political change did not come just out of a black box, or by accident. You also had political organization which delivered, which contributed to change this belief system and to mobilize these beliefs and turn them into action. So in Europe, the role of social democratic parties in post-World War II welfare state consensus was very large. In France, you had the plan by the Conseil National de la Résistance, which sort of basically planned in advance the social security system that would be put in place after 1945 in France. In Britain, to some extent, with the Beveridge Report, you have something similar. In the US, you don't have the social democratic tradition, but you have a very particular political coalition beginning with Roosevelt, where, to some extent, for the first time, and hopefully not the last time, but at least almost the only time in history in the US between 1930 and 1960 or 70 or 80, the poor white and the poor black vote for the same party, namely the Democratic Party. So this is the Roosevelt coalition, which is not something you had, of course, in the 19th century, because the Democratic Party was a party of slavery. So they had the poor white, in particular in the South, but certainly not the black vote, who was voting massively for the Republican Party in the 19th century. And today, of course, you don't really have this anymore, because as we know, the poor white have largely escaped from the Democratic Party, and in particular in the last election. So there was a particular coalition at the time which made it possible, it has lasted for so long that we tend to view this as the normal situation, but it is not clear whether this is really the normal situation. So the questions we want to ask is, was there something exceptional and inherently unstable in the post-World War II class-based politics and pro-redistribution coalition? What I would argue is that maybe it was not exceptional, but certainly it was very specific. And there are deep changes in the structure of electoral conflicts since the 1980s, 90s, which are not favorable to the development of pro-redistribution coalition. And in particular, in Europe, and I'm going to show you data and conclude with this for France and French election, left-wing parties used to attract predominantly low and middle wealth voters, and also low and middle education voters. And gradually, since the 1980s, 90s, they have started to attract more and more highly educated voters, while less educated voters gradually turn to the right. So let me first show you, so this was, in a way, this is the classic class-based political conflict. So we are back to the 1970s, and then I'm going to show you the evolution until today. So this is the relation between wealth and vote. So wealth is actually, if you look for economic variables to predict vote, wealth has always a stronger predictive power than income. Income is complicated because it depends, well, partly on your wealth, but it depends also on your education. It depends whether you work in the public or private sector. So the relation with respect to income, well, it tends to go in the same direction, or at least it used to go in the same direction. Lower income voters tend to vote more for the left, but it's less strong than for wealth. For wealth, as you can see, this is extremely strong, and I show you the 1978 general election, but it will be the same for the 1974 presidential elections, 1960s, all the data we have. So this comes from post-electoral survey with like 10,000 people interviewed. So, this is reasonably reliable, and as you can see, so this is an election where the left and the right were almost perfect equality. Actually, the right won the majority because of the way constituencies are drawn, but it was almost 50%, 50%, but you can see people who don't own anything vote 70% for the left, people who own a lot. So we have information in the post-electoral survey about do you own your primary residence, secondary residence, financial portfolio, do you own your firm, do you own saving accounts, so you can construct index of wealth, and this is pretty clear. If we look now at the education profile, it is much less clear to begin with. So in fact, it's more or less flat for education. So, education is not a very good predictor historically of the vote, because within each education group, you have almost 50%, 50% right and left. It depends on other factors. Well, it depends on your wealth for a given education group. It depends on your religious affiliations and all other dimensions, whether you are self-employed, wage earners, public sector, private sector. There are many other dimensions that are more important than education. For education, it used to be very balanced between left and right, and it's like this in most countries, except for the top education group, where you have indeed a bigger, smaller, you have like 46% for the left, 54% for the right, so it's a bit more voting for the right in the university graduates of the time, which were a minority of the population, but it's not very strong. Because you also had, students who were voting for the left, of course, already in the 60s, 70s. So in the end, it was balanced a bit more for the right, but not so much. Now, this is what has changed completely. So if you look, so now this is 2012 presidential election, where the left, Hollande wins against Sarkozy, 52-48. You can see that you have a much clearer pattern, where now the more educated voters vote for the left. Okay? So if you take, the people in the bottom, the people who don't have the baccalaureate, who dropped high school before the end, they vote only 45% for Hollande and 55% for Sarkozy, whereas university graduates vote 60% for Hollande, 40% for Sarkozy. Okay, so you have a clear pattern where the more educated you are, the more on average you vote for the left, which is something we had never seen before in electoral history, and we see the same in other countries. You know, I have not checked the UK data, but I have checked the US data, and you have the same evolution where gradually the vote for Democratic Party has become more and more high degree vote. Now, how is it going to look like on Sunday? I don't know, but still I am showing you the data. Well, you know, okay, this is an assumption. So here I have assumed 55% for Macron. You know, I think it will probably be closer to 60%, but you know, we don't know, of course, for sure. What we know is that whether it will be 55-45 or 60-40, we know that it will be very, very steep in terms of education-vote relationship. This we know for sure because you just need to look at the exit polls after the first round, and you know you can see at who voted for Macron, who voted for Le Pen, and you know by education group is extremely strong. So it will probably be much stronger than for Hollande. So here this is just a projections, but you know the numbers will not be very different. So you know the higher you go in the education group, the more you vote for the left, or at least for, you know, I don't know how much left is Macron, but certainly it's to the left of the extreme right if you put the extreme right. So the structure of political conflict has changed completely. So why is the left-wing vote becoming more and more the high education vote? Okay, so you can think of different explanations, some that have to do with the attitudes of voters, the changing attitude of voters, some that have to do with the changing attitudes of parties and different strategy of political parties, and I think both are important. From the point of view of voters, you know, you can think left-wing parties, even, you know, back in the 60s, 70s, or actually back in the 19th century, they always promoted individual emancipation through education. So maybe those who have succeeded from this strategy and have benefited from this strategy, you know, vote more naturally for the left, whereas, you know, people who did not benefit so much from this strategy feel more frustrated with respect to that, or at least feel less naturally inclined to vote for the left. You can also imagine that with globalization and the development of more diverse societies with more diverse ethnic origin, religious background in France or in Britain or in all developed countries, high education voters and together with them left parties tend to have more support for the universal values associated to globalization, post-colonial, multi-ethnic societies, whereas low education voters feel further away from, you know, they don't travel as much, they don't feel as close to the different other groups, and they feel to some extent abandoned by the left-wing parties and threatened by globalization, immigration, which makes them gradually turn to xenophobic right. And then left-wing parties observing this situation can shift further their economic policy and fiscal policy to the right, because basically they say, okay, we have lost this low education vote anyway, so, you know, let's try at least to be strong on our core voting group, which is more high education. And, you know, whether it's a good or bad strategy or morally good, morally bad, you know, it's complicated, and all of you can have an opinion on this, and I have my own opinion on this. But as a matter of fact, I think this is a lot of what has been happening. So the question is, how far will it go? So is the next step that the left-wing vote will also become the high wealth vote and not only the high education vote? Well, maybe this is already what we are going to see on Sunday. So this, we really don't know, because if I return to the changing relation between vote and wealth, it's a very different story than for education. So you can see we start from a situation where the high wealth voters vote clearly for the right, you know, almost 80% in 1978. If you look for Hollande, it is less steep, but it is still quite steep. Okay, so you can see it's the reverse curve from education. Okay, so from education, so basically the high education and low wealth, middle wealth people vote for the left in France in 2012. At the low education or very high wealth people vote for the right. So you can see the top 10% wealth holders, you know, they voted 65% for Sarkozy versus 35% for Hollande. So wealth, at least as of 2012, was still a strong predictor of the left-wing vote versus right-wing vote, less than in 1978. But now, what is going to happen on Sunday? This I don't know. So this is really a projection. But again, if I use, I just took the data that we had from the exit polls of the first round. It is possible we have a reverse relationship because in particular the first round vote for Macron was very much concentrated in higher wealth groups. And if you look at this is more fragile, but if you look at the polls among, in particular, the Fillon voters, the right-wing voters, those with more wealth tend to go more to Macron than to Le Pen, and those with less wealth tend to go more to Le Pen. But, of course, we will know more next week, so, next time you invite me, I can show you the real data. I'm not saying this will be like this. I think this will be much flatter. I think it will be upward sloping as compared to 2012, but how much upward sloping, this is difficult to say. This is a difference also with the US, because in the US, if you look at the Trump-Clinton vote, in terms of wealth, the higher wealth group, tended to vote a bit more for Trump, not that much more, but a bit more for Trump than for Clinton. For education, the more educated voted more for Clinton, of course, but for wealth, you still have, very favored, economically well-off vote in favor of Trump, which is a difference between Trump and Le Pen, who really scares a lot high wealth group more than Trump. I don't know if maybe they should be scared as well, but anyway, this is what we have. Okay, so does this mean, and I'm going to conclude there, does this mean that we are gradually shifting from a political conflict where you have the left against the right, and the left has more of the poor vote and the right has more of the rich vote, and you have this sort of class-based conflict with redistribution, to a different form of political conflict where you have the progressives versus the nationalists, which is a little bit the way Macron and Le Pen want to describe themselves. So both Macron and Le Pen say, well, the left and the right, they don't exist anymore. So Macron says, I am more the progressive side against the nationalist, and Le Pen says, I am a nationalist, but in a positive sense. I believe in solidarity at the national level. And so are we moving to a form of political conflict where, in effect, the progressives attract more, the more richer, well-off vote, both in terms of education and possibly in terms of wealth as compared to the nationalist vote? There are powerful forces which are pushing in this direction, and clearly, if we go in this direction, this is certainly not favorable to redistribution, and this is not going to lead to a political coalition with a lot of redistribution. There are also forces pushing in opposite direction. I think rising inequality does also lead for rising demand for class-based politics. Identity-based conflict is very unstable because typically it can also give rise to conflict between countries. This is the problem with the nationalists, is that they don't agree with one another. So, in pre-World War I Europe, the rise of nationalism, which you can also interpret to some extent as a response to the extreme inequality of the time and the inability to reduce inequality through peaceful means, and this, I think, contributed to the rise of social tension and to some extent nationalism. In the end, of course, this ended up in war, so this was particularly unstable. And I'm not saying the same is going to happen, of course, but I think there is some inherent instability in identity-based conflict. Which implies that there's no reason it will last forever. Historical bifurcation will happen again and again. So if you take the recent election in the US and in France, it's clear that different outcomes could have happened. So in the end, everybody can make a difference. I guess each individual has its own, is part of the collective decision, and these things are not deterministic. So we could have had Sanders, Trump at the second round of the US presidential election. We could have had Mélenchon, Le Pen in France. So Mélenchon, for those of you who don't know, was the more radical left candidate, and this would have led to very different political outcomes, not necessarily better. It's complicated. In particular, Mélenchon against Le Pen. Maybe Le Pen could have won, maybe Mélenchon would have won, but with policies that would not necessarily have been the best policies in the world. So I'm not trying to pretend there's one good way to try to contribute to this political process and one bad way. I'm just saying it's important to look at these different evolutions so that we can all make our own opinion and try to better understand these processes. So let me conclude, and I know we are going to have time for questions. the general conclusion that I draw from these two lectures and from my research is that the history of income and wealth inequality is first political. It's not it does not simply involve economic mechanism. What we have learned is that it involves belief system, national identities, sharp reversals. Wars and revolution played a very important role in the 20th century, and probably you will also have very chaotic evolution in the 21st century. In a way, both Marx and Kuznets are wrong to some extent, although in fact their thought was much more complicated in both cases, but Marx is sometimes viewed as predicting sort of ever-increasing inequality, and Kuznets, with the idea of a Kuznets curve, predicting a natural decline in inequality in advanced stages of development. Both were wrong in the sense that there are powerful forces pushing in both directions, and in the end, what really matters is the institutions, the policies that different society choose. Ideal solution to regulate and reduce inequality involves a broad combination of policy, taxation, education, labor market, new arrangement to organize property. Probably my main takeaway from all of this, and I hope that I have convinced you of this, is that looking at the history of inequality and taxation is important if we want to be able to look at the different alternatives for the future. I think the most important lesson from history is that there are different alternatives. There are always alternatives. There are different ways to organize capitalism. There are different levels of inequalities that can happen. In a way, our main enemy, or at least my main enemy, is intellectual nationalism. The fact that each country tends to view itself as unique, exceptional, and this is very strong in the US, but this is also very strong in Britain, certainly in France as well. People think, okay, the problem we have to solve are completely different from the problems that other countries have to solve. And of course, this is always wrong. I think there's always a lot to learn by putting in broad historical and comparative perspective the history of inequality, so that we can contribute to a more informed democratic conversation. So thanks a lot for your attention.